Good morning, everybody. My family loves blueberries. The problem is I am in Ohio and I have alkaline clay soil, which blueberries hate. I have tried doing in-ground plantings. I've built up raised beds. I've amended the soil, but our native soil leaches out the acidity so quickly that my blueberries have always just struggled the entire time they've been in the ground. So the compromise that I've found is growing them in containers because I can control that growing media and make it the perfect environment for blueberries. Now, I'll never be able to open a blueberry farm, but we can have a few blueberries sitting on the patio and actually pick fruit off of them, which is really nice. So if you're in a similar predicament where you'd like to grow blueberries, but your soil is not optimal for blueberry production, take heart. You can grow them in pots, they do really well. The key is getting your soil right. So blueberries have a low pH requirement, typically between 4.5 and 5.0. This is much lower than most garden vegetables and some fruits. They also prefer over 3% organic matter and good drainage. They do not like to have wet feet. So we're just wanting to provide them a mix, which is going to give them all of those things. Now you can take the easy route, which I have done before with great success. You can buy pre-mixed bags of potting media for acid-loving plants. So I have used, it was called the Blueberry Success Mix from Gardens Alive for my own blueberries, and that's worked really well. You can pick up acid-loving potting mix for, usually it'll say for rhododendrons, azaleas, and camellias from your local big box store or garden center, and those mixes will work really well. Often those have fertilizer for acid plants built right in, so you just basically fill up your container, plop in your blueberry plant, and you're done. It's really quick and simple. Today, though, I was out of my mix, so I wanted to blend up something with what I had on hand. So in doing a little research on the best do-it-yourself blueberry potting mixes, what I came across repeatedly from places like university extension agencies, the American High Bush Blueberry Council, and several other sources, was they were all recommending a 1-to-1 mix of soil and peat moss. And that will achieve the purpose. It does provide good drainage and blueberries will be very happy. The only problem with that is that if you can avoid using peat in your mixes, you probably should. The continual harvest of peat is really starting to lead to the destruction of vulnerable wildlife habitats, and there are other options. So you could go with something like a coconut coir and just do a 1-to-1 mix of potting soil and coconut coir, and then throw in an acid-loving fertilizer, and you would be good to go. What I am using today is this ProMix Premium Organic Garden Mix. I like this because it has mycorrhizae in it, and it does really well for containers. I've got some coconut coir that I'm going to mix in. I actually already have some mushroom compost in this planter here. And mushroom compost is just the leftover growing media after the mushroom crop is harvested. And typically it will contain things like composted animal manure, sometimes leaf compost. It does sometimes contain peat moss, but it's whatever that particular grower happens to be using to grow their mushrooms on. And this is a local source. I've been really happy with this. I use it in my containers and in my gardens, and it seems to make my plants really happy. So I'm throwing some of that in. And then the last thing will be a fertilizer for acid-loving plants. And same thing, when you're looking for a fertilizer, you can typically find, this is a slow release, it's a 1477, and it is for acid-loving plants. So it says azaleas, camellias, rhododendrons. Any type of formulation like that, your blueberries are going to be happy with as well. I've also used this in the past. It's Gardens Alive's blueberry fertilizer, again formulated for acid-loving plants. And typically when you're getting an organic slow release acid fertilizer, they're going to contain things like cottonseed meal, because cottonseed meal is low pH but a good source of nitrogen for plants. It may include things like feather meal. Sometimes it will include elemental sulfur. Elemental sulfur is commonly used to lower pH in the soil. The thing to keep in mind with elemental sulfur, it actually has to be converted by the soil bacteria into sulfuric acid to be effective. And that can only happen in warm, moist conditions during your typical growing season. And it can take, at the minimum, 3 months to occur. So what I saw was that recommendations for lowering your soil's pH with elemental sulfur said to apply it to the soil 3 months to up to a year ahead of planting time. Now that's in a scenario where you're actually wanting to lower your native soil's pH. Since we're planting in a pot and we've already got all of the elements in there that are going to make our blueberries happy, that's not so much of a concern, but it is something to keep in mind anytime that you might be using elemental sulfur. Polytone is another commonly recommended amendment for acid-loving plants, and that's pretty commonly available. But anything formulated for acid-loving, preferably a slow-release, all-natural fertilizer, is going to work really well. Do follow the manufacturer's instructions for application, though. Blueberries are very sensitive to over-fertilization, and in this case, more is not better. You want to follow those instructions, and you do not want to over-fertilize. So, with that being said, I'm going to mix up my potting media and get this blueberry planted. So as I mentioned, I already have some mushroom compost in here. I actually already have a little bit of the garden mix. I'm going to add some of this coconut coir, and you can see very similar texture to peat moss. I'm going to add some of my garden mix here. It is a compressed bale, so this will kind of need broken up. And then I am just going to get in here. I probably should have done this in a bigger bucket, but that's okay. And I am just going to mix all of this. You can also do this in layers, which is really effective. So basically think of making a giant parfait. You would do a little coconut coir, a little potting mix, a little fertilizer in one layer, and just continue to layer that up the pot, which makes it really nice and easy to mix this. And then I'm gonna use this stuff today because, like I said, I've used this before. This calls for 1 cup per planting hole for newly planted blueberry shrubs. So I am just going to add a cup of this fertilizer now and mix that in. And then you'll also want to make sure to reapply fertilizer each spring, ideally before the new growth starts leafing out, to keep your blueberries happy. So we're gonna get this all mixed in. Next, I like to thoroughly saturate the potting media before planting. This just seems easier to me because I can make sure that the media is soaked all the way through to the bottom before planting. Now it's important that you keep your blueberries regularly watered as they grow. Blueberries have shallow root systems and are very sensitive to drying out. So 1 to 2 inches per week consistently is a good amount to aim for. Adding a mulch on the top of your planting media can also aid in keeping the roots cool and damp. Okay, now we can go ahead and get this blueberry planted. This is pretty fibrous, has a fair amount of root growth in there, so I'm going to break it up pretty roughly here. Rough up those roots. It'll make that plant reach out into the soil. And then you just want to plant these at the same level they were growing in the nursery, which means you want this to be level with the soil surface. And I'm just going to dig in there, plop this puppy right in here. Now, pot size, I'm sure, is a question that you probably have. I've not grown a blueberry in a pot smaller than 20 gallons, and I actually prefer a 50-gallon pot for most blueberries. Smallest you can probably go is about 24 inches wide by 24 to 30 inches tall. I would not try going any smaller than that. Now, if your plants are really small when you get them, you can pot them up in a small pot and then transplant them into larger pots as they grow. But you just want to make sure that whatever your plant ends up in, it has plenty of room for its root mass. And then my final step here is going to be to add a pine bark mulch. So these are pine fines. It's just a finely shredded pine bark. But this works really well because, as I mentioned before, it helps to hold moisture in the soil, as well as being a little bit acidic. So you could even actually mix pine fines into your potting soil. That works really well. But they make a great mulch. Now, a few other bits of advice for blueberries in containers. There are different types of blueberries. So there are things like northern highbush, southern highbush, dwarf, wild blueberries, or rabbit eyes. So true to their name, northern and southern highbush are going to be larger plants. Rabbit eyes are as well, but they can get up to 6 feet tall. Now, growing them in a container is going to restrict their growth, so they won't get that big, but you're definitely going to want to opt for a bigger pot if you're growing one of those types. You can get a dwarf or a half high or a wild type blueberry. Top hat is a variety that jumps to mind. They're only going to get about this tall. And those are really ideal for smaller containers on patios because they're really suited to that smaller size pot. The other thing is that while most types of blueberries are technically self-pollinating, except for rabbit eyes, they do need a pollinator, and those are typically grown in the south. Other blueberries are going to set a higher yield of fruit with another cultivar with a similar bloom time nearby. So if you can do 2 pots with 2 different cultivars in them on your patio, that's a great way to do it. One plant, you will get some fruit, you'll just get more with another one close by. Now, the cultivar I have planted up today is called Kablooey blueberry, and I've actually already got some on my patio that are the Reka, it's R-E-K-A, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, variety. And so all of these blueberries will be sitting there together. You also want to be considerate of where you place your containers. So blueberries do prefer full sun, that's 6 to 8 hours a day of sunlight. If you live in a warm climate, you may want to provide some protection from that strong late afternoon sun because sometimes that will tend to burn up blueberry plants. Full sun is going to give you best flavor and best fruit production. Conversely, in cold climates, you're going to want to think about winter protection. Most blueberries are going to be hardy to about -20 Fahrenheit. Being above ground in a container is going to make them more susceptible to freeze damage in the winter. So it's a good idea to either move them to a protected spot in the winter, so like an unheated greenhouse, an unheated garage with some windows, something like that. You can also put straw bales around the base of your planter or wrap everything really thickly in burlap. Basically anything that's going to insulate that pot. I've even heard of people digging big holes, dropping that whole pot in the ground for the winter because that's going to give it similar to protection to being in ground. I typically do the greenhouse or the straw bale method, and that has worked well for me. And again, I'm in Ohio 6A, so if you're in like zone 5, 4, 3, you're going to want to give even more consideration to how you're protecting these plants through the winters. And then the very last thing, next year when you've got fruit on your plants, be aware that the birds also love blueberries and they will try to steal all the fruit. So you'll be admiring your wonderful crop set, you'll be waiting for them to turn the perfect shade of blue, you'll think, oh, tomorrow's the day, and that morning all the birds will strip your plant. It happens inevitably, it's happened to me a million times. So if you notice that birds are eyeballing your plants, you may want to invest in some bird netting. Again, it's easy with containers because you can just drape that netting over the whole plant and pot, and that's going to keep birds from most of the fruit so that you're getting some to actually enjoy after all your hard work. But that's it. Go get yourself some blueberries and big old pots and plant up some blueberries today. And if you find content like this helpful, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.